So let's talk about starting an army for one of the most elite and secretive forces in the entire Imperium, with a review of collecting Grey Knights in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about getting a Grey Knight army off the ground in the current game, going from why you might want to assemble a force of Demon Hunters of Titan, some planning for putting your force on the tabletop, first miniature purchases, and a talk through the major kits of the Grey Knight army, and a quick talk about rules and one example army list at the end. Loads to talk about, so let's don some true silver armour, and load the side cannons, and prepare to cast some demons back into the warp. First up, why might you want to collect Grey Knights as an army in Warhammer 40k to start with, in terms of lore, miniatures, and gameplay? In the lore, the Grey Knights represent a hyper-elite demon-hunting Space Marine chapter based on Jupiter's moon of Titan. They have close ties to the Ordo Malleus branch of the Inquisition, focusing on crushing chaos and sending warp spawn back to where they belong. The Grey Knights really are a unique chapter out of the other Space Marines. Literally every man is an incorruptible psyker. Grey Knights have never had a single Space Marine fall to the temptations of chaos despite their otherworldly gifts, and they're one of the very most elite forces that the Imperium can field. In terms of 40k armies, maybe second only to the Adeptus Custodes of Terror. The Grey Knight Prognosticar Psykers are able to foretell and predict where demon incursions might happen in the galaxy. Grey Knight vessels being dispatched out to the zone of concern before the demons have even had chance to manifest, and they proceed to gather local Imperial forces and do battle with whatever warp entities, rogue psykers, or chaos factions might have unleashed the warp spawn on the galaxy, sealing portals with great rituals, otherwise fighting ceaselessly to stop the great game of the Chaos Deities spilling out into the galaxy of Warhammer 40k. In battle, the Grey Knights are a very elite force with very few numbers. They fight in their distinctive true silver armour, and their power armour maybe has a bit of a holy puritanical knight sort of vibe. They use their psychic gifts to amp up their exotic armoury, with things like force weapons and psi cannons amongst their ranks, and they often fight with great teleport tactics. Their elite Terminator formations being shunted into battle, and often making use of personal teleporters to perform more localized jumps when they're engaged. Miniatures wise, as 40k ranges go, the Grey Knights have a slightly small range in the game currently, though I feel like the kits that they have to represent them do at least go a fair way. The faction is primarily represented by three main unique plastic kits for them, the Striped Marine ones in power armour, the Grey Knight Brotherhood Terminators, and the Nemesis Dread Knight. Though all of those boxes are really quite flexible and can build multiple different datasheets with different wargear options, they can also use a small selection of more generic Space Marine units like Rhino transports and Land Raiders and things, and a few of their more generic HQ models. I would say that compared with most 40k armies, while the kits are fun, flexible, and still belong to the slightly newer age of Games Workshop plastics, where things got a little bit more custom and multi-part, they're still kind of dated by the rest of 40k standards now. At some point, Grey Knights certainly are going to get a Primaris scaling remake at some point. Bigger, beefier Space Marines and Terminators similar to their more standard Space Marine brethren, perhaps on the same sort of scale as the current Castell and Crow miniature. I feel like that does put them in a slightly awkward spot for getting together an army, as at some point Games Workshop is going to update the range, but we have no idea when. They do also have a few older models within their range, say Caldor Drago and the standard Brother Captain are both really quite old resin miniatures, and lagging behind the rest of 40k for updates. For a taste of miniatures within their range, here's the Grey Knight Strike Squad, elite power armoured Space Marines that have wrist-mounted storm bolters and fight with force weapons of one sort or another, and you can use that same kits to build other variations like these Interceptors with these sort of personal teleporter things on their backpacks. The Nemesis Dread Knight is the heavy lifter for the faction, a great big exosuit with a Terminator strapped in that's aimed to be able to go toe-to-toe with enemy greater demons out there. It certainly divides opinion a bit on the construction of this thing though, many people affectionately referring to it as the baby carrier. Grey Knight Terminators, like these guys on the right, are a lot more mainstream for the Grey Knights than other factions. Brotherhood Terminators can be fielded as a battle line unit, and these are the hyper-elite Paladins, hardy veterans of many battles. Otherwise, besides access to a few generic Space Marine things, the Grey Knights have a fair cast of characters. Caldor Drago is essentially their Grandmaster Chapter Master type figure. Castell and Crow of the Purifiers wields the Cursed Blade of Antwer, and Grandmaster Baldus is a slightly recent Terminator Grandmaster sculpt wielding a mighty demon hammer. Certainly one of the advantages of collecting Grey Knights is that pricing is generally one of the cheapest armies in Warhammer 40k. In general, the cheap ones tend to be ones where you need fewer models than most. There's really great points per dollar on basically all of their kits, and that's backed up by a particularly helpful combat patrol. The discount on this isn't enormous, but given that Grey Knight kits tend to be at least good value for points on the board to start with, it helps out. As we'll mention later, it does basically have the entire faction in Microcosm, and you could buy it multiple times. Gameplay wise, Grey Knights are represented by Index Grey Knights, a digital download from Games Workshop, their primary signature playstyle being massive teleport tricks, units blinking on and off the board and striking from unexpected angles, that may be balanced out a bit with slightly limited damage dealing. They have to make the most out of their close range shooting to kill infantry, and then usually dealing some damage to heavier hitters in close combat, though they might have some slight weaknesses in punching up against enemy tanks and monsters. Grey Knights find it quite easy to score secondary objectives and things due to all this teleporting going on, and I feel like to absolutely master them to a high level of play, they do reward higher skill players than lower skill. Just because you have a crazy amount of movement tricks, but knowing exactly which ones to use when can lead to some big decisions that you could get right or wrong. I feel like if anything that's a positive though. They're still certainly very playable for newer players, but it means that they can get very good as you get more experienced. Currently, post-balance updates where they got some Dread Knight buffs, they're doing rather well. They've got about a 51% win rate after the balance data slate. It's quite nice to see Dread Knights returning as really quite a playable option again. Previously, they were a bit too underpowered, and that definitely exacerbated Grey Knights not being very good against monsters or vehicles. In any case, though, if you want a puritanical force of silver-armoured Space Marines casting down the forces of chaos, the Grey Knights could be the army for you. If you do choose to collect Grey Knights, there's plenty of places that you could go out there and seek out a bit more info about these secretive demon slayers. Index Grey Knights is definitely worth a read through to start with. You can download that from Games Workshop's Warhammer 40k downloads page. If you want to mess around with some army list building, you could try Battlescribe or New Recruit to see how units could fit together to make an army list. Maybe use Warhapedia for that, or even Games Workshop's own app for rules and army lists. You can certainly try things out before you buy them, proxy in miniatures with other things on the tabletop before you go out and splash the cash on a whole army, or play in Tabletop Simulator if that's something that you do. And there's absolutely tons more information out there on the internet. Here on YouTube, I've made a fair few Grey Knights videos, a Grey Knights index overview at the start of the 10th edition, a tier list of their units, and a slightly more recent review of their stronger tournament armies. I'll leave a link to a couple of those down in the video description. Otherwise though, there's tons of other stuff out there, battle reports, painting guides, and all sorts of lore on other channels. Just literally search Grey Knights and you'll have plenty to go at. For other gameplay and tactics type things, I did notice there was a channel called 40k Dirtbags which had a fair bit of Grey Knights content. Their stuff seems to go over pretty well. And there was also a channel called One Last Blaze that was active a bit more in 9th edition, that has plenty of interesting stuff from a collecting and hobbying point of view, even if their rules videos will be out of date now. Otherwise, I'd absolutely think about joining any social media for the Grey Knights that you can. Join their Discord server, sign up to Facebook groups if you use that, or check out their subreddits. Just by having a look over the discussions of players going out and doing their thing, you just get to grips on what the army does in passing. Loads of examples for painting and conversion type things that you can do, and can be a good place to ask some basic questions to other existing collectors. When you feel like you've got a rough sort of idea for a faction, I'd think about planning a rough army list to build towards. I'm certainly not saying that this would be a be-all and end-all, and you could certainly flex things around as you go, but I feel like having a rough army list can give you a general sort of idea of what you might wind up with an army at the end of the collection. Maybe make yourself an 1,000-point army list or 2,000-point army list on Battlescribe or New Recruit or something. Compared with some other factions out there, I feel like Grey Knights tend to be maybe a little bit more monolithic, and Grey Knight armies tend to be a bit more similar to each other compared with all the various different ways you could go with, say, Space Marines. In my experience, the majority of players tend to collect a fairly balanced collection with a good mix of Strike Marines, Terminators, and Dread Knights being the things at the forefront of their choices, maybe supported by a few generic Space Marine options. I likely aim to have a core force of their plastic kits, although you could certainly skew things a bit and build out to have options like full Terminator armies on the table, or being able to fill mass Dread Knights, maybe a Grand Master and 3 regular ones. You could go more heavily into more generic Space Marine options like have a Land Raider on the table, or get a few transports on the go such as Rhinos or Razorbacks. At around this sort of phase as well, it's worth thinking about colour schemes and painting up a test model. I think my first choice would be a standard strike marine type body to paint up to test out a scheme on. Go for the smallest standard troop that you can get. Decide whether or not you think the scheme works well for you before you farm it out to an entire army worth of models. I guess you could start with a Brotherhood Terminator as an alternative option though, as Grey Knights do kind of use them as their battle line troops. There's certainly lots of ways that they can achieve their classic silvery sort of look. They're definitely one of the armies that you could paint up very quickly indeed if you wanted to. You can get a fairly effective looking army literally by a silver spray, wash it with some Nuln oil, and then maybe do some highlights with a lighter silver sort of colour. There are lots of ways that you can achieve nice metal colours though, say spraying black and then either airbrushing or dry brushing on the metal over it, going for a more contrasty sort of non-metallic metal sort of hue, and plenty more options besides. I'd likely approach it by taking a look at a few painting guides here on YouTube. Games Workshop have certainly made some all of their own, so you could look at those first, but there's loads from other creators as well. And while Grey Knights do have their iconic silvery sort of colour scheme, you don't necessarily have to stick to it if you don't want to. They are your models after all. In the lore, they typically tend to fight in their silver battle armour, though realistically there's nothing stopping you from going your own way, painting them an entirely different colour, something matte or something else metallic if you wanted to, and maybe make up a reason why they're fighting that way for your own lore. Getting on to the exciting bit though, let's talk miniatures. I feel like if I were jumping into Grey Knight, I feel like there's a big draw just to starting with the Combat Patrol Grey Knights, generally considered to be one of the better ones out there for 40k armies. This one does have a whole load of positives. Otherwise, if you just wanted to dip a toe in the faction and not get a box that was quite as expensive, I'd probably go for a box of Paladins or a Strike Squad box if you just want to paint up a few models and see how you get on with them first. Focusing on that Combat Patrol box set though, here's what you get inside it. You get a Librarian in Terminator armour, 5 Strike Marines that you could build as the other specialty power armour squads if you wanted, a unit of Grey Knights Terminators that could build the standard Terminators or Paladins, and a Nemesis Dread Knight. Overall it does just feel pretty ideal for a Grey Knight Combat Patrol in my opinion. Literally every kit here is one that you could easily have in multiples in your army if you wanted. Certainly for the squads and the Dread Knights, there's nothing wrong with having 3 of each of copies of those, given that they are the main 3 kits of the army. And even as it goes, the Terminator Librarian is one of the HQs that people are most likely to take multiple of in-game, with his big scary mortal wound damage dealer Vortex of Doom. The Combat Patrol box set is £95, €125 or $160, and like the other Combat Patrol boxes, it does give you a discount versus buying these separately. The discount for the Grey Knight one is maybe a little bit on the lower side compared with the rest. You only get 20% off versus other ones that could be sort of 30 to 40-ish. But I feel like, to be honest, that's not actually the end of the world given that literally every single kit is useful in multiples. You get about 630 points worth of miniatures in the box. Could be a bit more if you assemble some of the squads in their slightly more points expensive versions. That's around about 4 points per dollar, which is very good in the grand scheme of things for 40k, given they still get you towards a full army of any one size quicker than most. Overall, I feel like this is just a very helpful kit with getting together a Grey Knight army. I feel like not that many factions have combat patrols that you could very easily just get 3 copies of and then have the vast majority of a 2,000 point army then and there. There's quite a good balance here, and I guess it's further helped by their core kits being able to be assembled in different ways, say Terminators and Paladins, and the Strike Marines being different variants of the power armor. When picking up 40k miniatures, I would bear in mind the different ways in which you can do so. You can buy things directly from Games Workshop, which often tends to be the most reliable but also the most expensive way to get models on the board. I personally tend to use local gaming stores or online retailers for discounts, and there's plenty of official Warhammer 40k stockists around the world that stock Games Workshop's products at a discount compared with their own web store. I do have a few of those links down in the video description around the world. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10%, and Wargame Portal in the USA for 15% off. Those ones are channel affiliates, so anything bought through them do go to help support Auspex Tactics just a little bit. They don't cost you any extra to use though if you are looking to pick up some models at some point in the near future. And given the expense of Warhammer miniatures, you can certainly add up to a fair amount of savings by using these or other stores like them in your local area versus the Games Workshop web store direct. The link's down in the video description if you'd like to check them out. A massive thank you to all you guys who are using them. Otherwise though, Grey Knights are an army that have been around quite a long time, So you do certainly have some second-hand market turnover for them. Looking on places like eBay or local groups could potentially get you some good deals on Grey Knight miniatures. Quality can of course be really quite variable, so make sure you've got good pictures of what you're buying, but could be a shortcut to both saving time for assembly and painting and also money. And certainly in this day and age, 3D printing and third-party manufacturers really do have quite a lot of good alternative designs for Warhammer 40K style miniatures. The Grey Knights do seem to be a fairly popular army for alternative sculpts to be made for them. I've certainly seen some people with entire 3D printed armies of power armored proxies that work well for Grey Knights, and in particular I feel like there's a lot of designers out there who have made some very nice alternative Dread Knight sculpts. Perhaps a bit more motivation on that one, given that the sort of strapped in Terminator divides opinions at best. Taking a closer look at a few of their kits and talking a bit more about them, the Strike Squad kit's £40 or $65. That one gets you 10 Elite Grey Knights in power armour. You can build the standard Strike Marines that are kind of like their troops, though also Interceptors, Purifiers, or Purgation squads. I feel like Games Workshop have done at least fairly well with Grey Knight internal balance recently. Most of the squads are at least usable. Strike squads are quite nice to have in small numbers to hold down objectives even when you teleport away from them. Purifiers are pretty powerful with Castell and Crow for a big anti-infantry murder machine of a unit, and both Interceptors and Purgation squads are usable too. In previous times, Games Workshop would have different profiles for their force weapons and demon hammers and things, though they pivoted away from that in 10th edition and they all basically have the same sort of profile now, which while maybe it did have a bit of loss of flavour, it does mean that you can just assemble them with the power weapons that you think look coolest, and you're not doing yourself some sort of disservice rules-wise. For special weapon choices for the squad, the current vogue seems to be the Incinerator. They can teleport quite close and then use that to melt a bunch of enemy infantry. I feel like the Psy Cannon really isn't an awful choice either. It's kind of hard to go wrong with just with some general purpose damage 2 style shots. The Brotherhood Terminators or Paladins are £35 or $60 per 5 of them. Again, quite good points for the amount of money that you pay here, like the previous squad. These often tend to be the core of the army, given that some of the best Grey Knight characters can join these units due to them being in Terminator armour, things like the Terminator Librarian or Caldor Drago. Again, at least fairly well balanced. I do quite like the Brotherhood Terminators for their lethal hits on the charge, plus their Apothecary. The Paladins get a -1 to wounds, so are quite tanky, but they do hit on a 2+ with their force weapons as well. Some good advantages to each, I don't feel like either are unusable. Otherwise, for their core plastics, the Nemesis Dread Knights £42.50 or $70. For 10th edition until recently, they've been really quite weak in game. Games Workshop kind of flips that by upping their damage output quite a lot in the last balanced data slate, and now they're actually getting some pretty common use in competitive lists once more. You can run the model as a Grandmaster in a Nemesis Dread Knight. Might be worth just a bit of conversion to make it look a little bit more fancy and stand out a bit if you're doing that. The most common loadouts in game tend to be Psy Cannon and Incinerator for the arm weapons, giving you a good general purpose gun plus a fairly ferocious heavy flamer type attack, and then either the sword or the hammer for the close combat weapon. If I were getting these, I'd strongly think about magnetizing myself, just to future-proof against rules changes being a fairly expensive kit. Otherwise, for unique Grey Knight characters that I've been most tempted to pick up, Caldor Drago I think is really quite a fun centerpiece unit for the army. 125 points for the sort of chapter master that's lost in the warp for the Grey Knights. The Supreme Grand Master is just extra nice at getting a big squad of Terminators into close combat, and has very scary melee with the Titan Sword. Castell and Crow at time of recording is the newest sculpt miniature for the Grey Knights. He is maybe a little bigger and chunkier than his brother Marines, and I do quite like the model. He's a pretty efficient choice with a bunch of Purifiers to spam out a whole load of their Purifying Flame type attacks. Could be an interesting choice for using the 3-inch deep strike stratagem on. Otherwise, Terminator Librarians tend to be popular, and it's kind of good that they come in the Combat Patrol box set. They get to throw a whole bunch of mortal wounds at the enemy with their Vortex of Doom. Really quite nice, easy to use, and general purpose damage, even if it does come at a points premium these days. If I were collecting Grey Knights from a standing start, I'd like to get 1 or 2 copies of the Combat Patrol box set to start with, build up a core of the Grey Knights, and get in some games with them there. As ever, with collecting Warhammer 40K armies, bear in mind that there's always a whole load of scope for just collecting what you like the look of. 40K rules do tend to change over time, though currently, as mentioned, I'd rate Grey Knights as being in a fairly good spot. Most of their datasheets are at the very least usable. For philosophy of building an army, I'd like a core of Terminators or Paladins led by some characters, some smaller squads of power armoured Grey Knights in support, some Strike Marines to mark objectives with their sticky objectives role. The rest all have their advantages as well. And then I would get at least some Dread Knights for heavy lifting. You could field some as Grandmasters if desired. For their non-unique miniatures, generally the rules don't tend to support them quite as well. I feel like with the current game at the moment, I'd be somewhat tempted to pick up a Land Raider at some point. Could be a nice enough anchor style unit to get a bunch of things into melee, as it's generally helpful not to be teleporting every unit every turn. Maybe could be quite nice for delivering purifiers into shooting then combat. If you wanted more expansion, you could think about some Agents of the Imperium to run alongside. Grey Knights do feel like a bit of an inquisitorial army to start with. You could get some cheap henchman warbands, maybe converted from something. And the Calidus Assassin is quite a popular choice for jumping around the board as well as messing with enemy stratagems. Could give you yet more options to be scoring secondary objectives. I feel like Grey Knights maybe do have that niche at least somewhat covered within their own book. My theory for that would be to have a rough idea of a 2,000 point army list and work towards it in chunks rather than buying literally everything outright unless you're very experienced. Buy some models, paint them up, get some games in, then build the next chunk. Focusing back on rules for the army, Index Grey Knights is freely downloadable on Warhammer Community under the download section and Warhammer 40K. Other places to reference them exist. You could use Warhapedia or Games Workshop's Warhammer 40K app for reference. Current points costs are found in the Minotaur and Field Manual download in the same download section, and if you liked, you could try and find some index cards to pick up. They'll be viable until the Codex comes out. Can be handy to have some flashcards relevant in game, though bear in mind that a few of the stats, particularly of the Nemesis Dread Knight, will be wrong. Games Workshop improved them in the balanced data slate, giving them better weapon skill and harder hitting side cannons. The biggest development for Grey Knights in 10th edition will be when their Codex comes out. Currently we don't know when that's going to be, though Games Workshop will announce it a fair bit ahead of time most likely. The 10th Codex won't be out until at least autumn 2024 and could be a fair bit later than this if they're unlucky, but in general it should shake up the faction a bit and add a bit more interest. The main thing that the 10th edition codexes tend to add are a bunch of new detachments for the army, different ways to play. Could be interesting to see what else they do with them there. Codexes tend to come with some model releases as well. As mentioned, I feel like Grey Knights at some point are due a major range overhaul, but there's absolutely no guarantees that it's going to happen in 10th edition. Basically, we're just not going to know until nearer the time whether or not they're going to get some sort of whole army refresh similar to Black Templars when they got their models redone, or they decide to just remake some characters at a bigger upscaling, maybe in a similar sort of way to Castell and Crow. Maybe the standard Brother Captain or Brother Captain Stern both could be pretty reasonable options for them to go if they did that, I guess. I must admit that is one negative to collecting Grey Knights at the moment. You don't know whether they might come out with some big fun and cool models for the entire faction at a later date. It's going to happen at some point, but at time of recording it could be literally years and years away, so it's probably not best to hold your breath and wait for it. For current rules, as mentioned, Grey Knights tend to be really quite teleport focused right now. The primary faction rule is called Teleport Assault, and depending on the game size, you basically get to take a bunch of Grey Knights off the board at the end of your opponent's turn, put them up into the Teleportarium, and then deep strike them next turn to inflict wrath upon the foe. It is really quite interesting and makes Grey Knights a fairly tricky opponent to face. They'll be guaranteeing to put their units at the most problematic places, though it does mean that they can have some more problems against high board control armies, things that can push them back quite a long way. It's also maybe a little bit easier for reliably delivering shooting units as opposed to assault units, as you have to make 9-inch charges if you've deep striked. So if you're trying to make things get to combat, then unless you're with Caldor Drago, it's going to be a gamble at best. For good supporting rules, some of their best stratagems are ones that double down on teleporting. Mists of Deimos is an incredibly tricky one. If enemies wind up making a move that comes close to you, you can get to return Grey Knight units to reserve, so a big unit that your opponent was just lining up a whole bunch of damage on might just vanish. That's a very powerful stratagem that I'd aim to use multiple times per game. Otherwise, big ones are Prognosticated Arrival, which can allow you to deep strike anywhere that's greater than 3 inches away. That sort of gets around a lot of enemy screening and puts a big unit exactly where your opponent doesn't want it. And maybe for other staples, just for some extra survivability, True Silver Armor is rather nice. 1 CP to reduce enemy AP, particularly nice for Grey Knight 2+ armor saves in cover. I feel like the detachment enhancements are interesting enough as well. They've got some fun stuff like First to the Fray for a first turn deep strike. the Sigil of Exigence to allow units to return to Deep Strike once they get shot, plus a damage one and an extra charge one. They're all kind of interesting and are handy enough to have maybe on either Grandmaster Dread Knights or Terminator Librarians leading big squads. The Dread Knight, I think, is going to be an important unit for Grey Knights going forward while it stays at this points cost. It does play a bit different to the rest of the army, with things jumping up and down from the warp. The big advantage that this guy gets is that he can shoot and charge after he's advanced and fallen back, and the Grey Knight detachment rule allows you to auto-advance 6 inches, which is pretty big. Means that these guys can be hurtling around 14-inch movements, lighting up the enemy with some powerful Psy Cannon and heavy incinerator shooting, and then charging in with either a tank busting or general purpose melee profile. Kind of nice to see that these guys are actually somewhat threatening against enemy armor again, particularly with their Psy Cannon shooting. Finally, just to round up, here's one example 2000 point army list that's at least fairly balanced, and I feel like this is a pretty reasonable starting army that should be fairly effective on the board. Maybe not exactly optimised, but has a fairly balanced Grey Knights force that you could home from there. At the core of the force, we've got 3 units of Terminators, 2 units of 5 Brotherhood Terminators with the standard upgrades and an incinerator, and 1 unit of Paladins. 2 of those squads will be led by Librarians. Caldor Drago will go with one of the Terminator units to allow them a very easy charge into close combat out of Deep Strike that can be quite problematic. Then there's a unit of Strike Marines to put sticky objectives on the home objective, maybe teleport around to do secondaries or do sticky objectives on the midfield, and Castellan Crow to be a big alpha threat with a big unit of 10 Purifiers. They'll be aiming to be a bit of a nightmare for enemy infantry, could be a good target for the 3-inch Deep Strike stratagem, jumping into a place where they can just roast a whole load of enemy infantry with their Psy-Flame attacks and Storm Bolters. Perhaps after that they could return to the warp again with Mists of Deimos if it made sense. Then to provide a bit of heavy lifting for the army, there's 3 Nemesis Dread Knights. They take the Psy Cannon, Heavy Incinerator, and I've gone for the Nemesis Greatsword here, but you could go for Demon Hammers if you want to have a bit more armor cracking. They should keep the enemy busy with their fast movement and heavy firepower, being able to reach the enemy in multiple ways, either just by moving up the board very, very quickly, or teleporting out of the warp to get those heavy Psy Cannons on the things that they most need to destroy. Overall, I feel like that'd be at least a fairly fun and effective force built out of 3 combat patrols, plus just adding Caldor Drago and Castellan Crow. Perhaps one of the cheapest ways to get an effective tournament army on the go for Warhammer 40k in general, maybe just being rivaled by the Adeptus Custodes for efficiency there. In any case, hope you've enjoyed a general chat through collecting Grey Knights in Warhammer 40k. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Always keen to hear any advice or tips from current Grey Knight generals in how you might go about collecting the army. If you'd like to see a bit more for Grey Knights, I'll link my winning list video and the index overview down in the video description below. Feel free to check that out if you'd like, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics in general. I'll certainly keep the 40k videos coming, or certainly have more for the Knights of Titan at some stage. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. If you'd like to support the creation of more videos like this, any support is enormously appreciated. The link's down in the video description as well. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.